Welcome back, everybody. I am Matthew McQuilla, and I am here again with Professor Larry Catá to discuss his book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 16, The Black Hand and Red List, China Law and the Foreigner, Mutual Engagement on a Global Scale, written on Tuesday, September 17, 2019. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
Oh, pretty well, pretty well. Excited to be talking about this chapter.
Well, this is a thick chapter. It's 30 pages, but the more that is in it, the more good stuff that is in it, I assume. What made this chapter so important that you wanted to put so much within it?
Oh, Lord. I was wondering, those sugar-coated words were hiding a sharp question. Yes, this is actually one of the longest chapters in one of the longest essays in the book, and it comes about halfway through. And in a sense, it's a chapter that represents a bit of stock taking. And a bit of stock taking here because by this point, we're now well into September 17th. By this point, most of the actors, with the exception of one that we're going to talk about in our next conversation, which is the last group to be nicely examined, which are the protesters themselves. We've kind of been talking about them, but not really focusing on them for a number of reasons that we can talk about in our next conversation. But the other key actors are all here, and the way in which they begin to relate each other by the middle of September has become fairly clear. And so at this point, I wanted to stop. This is a series of essays. My focus was discourse. My focus was rhetoric and rhetorical tropes, and the way in which those are used to both create unities, diversities, to differences. And this chapter kind of was an exercise at this point. I just sat down and tried to figure out, well, how does this work in the context of China and the foreigner? In general, and then specifically, because by this point it's become clear that Hong Kong is becoming more and more embedded into the larger discourse between the two, what I call in other work, the two emerging post-global imperial orders, the Chinese and the US. How all of this frames out discursively in the context of the foreign, because for the Americans, China, in a sense, represents the foreign, but for the Chinese, of course, the Americans represent the foreign as well, each of whom then, in seeking to project their foreignness on each other, would tend to be viewed respectively as corrupting forces or useful forces, and at that point I said, well, let's see, can we rationalize this? Is there a way of actually looking at the discourse and seeing if there's something that that may give some kind of coherence, or at least some kind of basis for understanding what's going on when we're dealing with this mutual foreignness, this mutual projection, and its discourse. And so that's what I tried to do here.
So within that, you talk about the black hand when discussing the foreign first. And the first question I wanted to raise was, the black hand is assumed to be something that may be unnoticed or unseen or may not be known by the general public. Is this a way of determining what is Chinese and what isn't Chinese, and how effective this would be? Because I think we've touched on this many times throughout this book. And one of the things throughout the book that I noticed was that it is a recurring theme, and it is a plan that is set in play, and from my point of view, that does not end at any point in time. So can you answer that for me?
Sure. And actually it's more, it becomes very complicated, as you can imagine. Discursively, this is very simple, right? It's the 1-0 thing. You've got domestic, home, you've got foreign, other. And from a discursive perspective, what could be easier than black or white, 1 or 0? But the reality is, when you get down to to the operation of this, or the actual labeling of things, foreign or domestic, you get into trouble. And you get into trouble both in China and in the US for a couple of reasons. Reason number one: both under Chinese Marxist-Leninism and within the cultural construct that is the American political economic system, you have cultures that essentially grow by absorbing the foreign. Both cultures tend to be receptive of the foreign. They tend to like to take them and embed lessons, practices, understandings, and norms, domesticate them, and then grow from them. There are a ton of examples in the US. The last big one was, and of course, in the process, the group from which you're absorbing this is first viewed as a threat, and then is viewed as the source of those kinds of new things that then make you stronger. And so the last big one was the quote unquote economic threat of the Japanese in the 70s and early 80s. And all of a sudden, the Americans, especially American business, starts looking at them, importing a bunch of ideas, sensibilities, and the like, Americanizing them, and then growing and changing. The Chinese do the same thing. Now, Marxist-Leninism is a more formal structure. Ours is, of course, market-oriented, culturally dispersed, tends to be generally privatized. The Chinese system tends to be more formal. It tends to work through the pronouncements of the basic line of the political economic model as it evolves. And in this case, certainly since the late 70s and early 80s, you had the idea of emancipating the mind and reform and opening up. The idea being that you look for what is out there, what is the essence of what tends to be a marker of success and power among those countries worth emulating, or those cultures worth emulating. You study them, you bring them in, and you naturalize them, you eat them effectively, and then you absorb their nutrients. I'm using a biological example, but you get the point. You eat this stuff, it makes you grow stronger. It's like having a nice steak, a kind of cultural or economic or sociological steak, and then all of a sudden your muscles are stronger, and you move on, and it's no longer a steak, this thing that came from a cow over there. It is now part of your body. And so when you look at this stuff, and of course this comes from systems that are inherently incompatible with your own. So where are you drawing this stuff for reform and opening up? You're drawing them from the liberal democratic camp, the Americans, the Europeans, and the like. And these systems are not what you want to be, but they do things, they act in particular ways, some of which might be very useful. And so at the same time that both of these cultures are absorbing cultures, right, and naturalizing cultures, that's how they grow, and that's why they survived all this time, at least in the Chinese case, well, the US case too, bringing them up from the Greco-Roman sphere. They're essentially in their foundations equally ancient civilizations. At the same time, they survive because not only do they absorb, but they're infinitely wary of what is going on outside. And so you've got this constant negotiation between, yeah, wow, those long wheat things in the form of noodles look really good, and all of a sudden they become spaghetti, to, oh, these, whatever they're doing is the signal for foreign, bad, evil, and we've got to stop. And so where you mediate this and how you mediate this becomes an issue. And all the more so in places like Hong Kong, where both aspects of this clash. And so Hong Kong, for me, provided a great opportunity to refine this in its particular US-Chinese context. And I start in this case right? In working through this, right? So we've got absorbing cultures that are also wary cultures, that are quite autonomous and very proud cultures, but at the same time, cultures that are open, right? So they're both open and closed, and now engaging with each other. And I started by looking at an odd, what might have been an odd thing. It's a 1911 essay written by a Protestant missionary reporting on, he's very sympathetic to the Chinese, but also extraordinarily sympathetic to his own missionary objectives, right? Looking at the way in which China and the missionary, the West, right? Again, as I mentioned, in the West, it would be private markets. In this case, it's religious. How they work together, and in the context, I noted that, well, the template that he used, without being aware of it, because a lot of times discourse is taken for granted, but it's there. And when you looked at his discursive approach, in a lot of ways, it mirrors the way in which both the Chinese central authorities and the Western projectors of cultures tend to continue to act. And so that was the basis for this. And from it, I distilled a number of stereotypes from out of which one can get a better sense, I think, of judging the nature, what appears to be kind of weird, chaotic, and contradictory nature of the interactions of these two post-global imperial powers, imperial cultural powers, and at the same time, not so chaotic, not so contradictory, but actually quite remarkably both stable and rational.
So how careful were the Chinese, or was the Chinese government, to not paint Hong Kong as a whole as the Black Hand or as the foreign?
Well, that's the trick, isn't it? On the one hand, Hong Kong cannot be the Black Hand, but Hong Kong can be corrupted by it, right? So underlying all of this is the notion of corruption. So the Americans, and one saw this, one doesn't see this so much under the Biden administration, because this is a much more polite and euphemistic administration, as had been the habit of American elites before Mr. Trump. But one really saw it in the Trump administration, where these forms of polite euphemistic politics disappeared for 4 years. And that is the notion that, well, the Chinese will come and they will corrupt us, right? We aren't absorbing, we're being undermined and corrupted, but we're still us. The same applies the other way when you're looking at Hong Kong. Hong Kong is itself, right, corruptible and corrupted by these outside influences, but remains Hong Kong. Right, and so what one sees is here the application of kind of these stereotypes, which don't just go in one direction, but they go in a variety of different directions, to begin to separate out that kind of absorption, which is the absorption with respect to which the central authorities are comfortable. Technology, administration, commerce, and those kinds of cultural, I almost said appropriation, but cultural borrowings, which would then tend to undermine. And so you have here, and then you have here this creation of a distinction, which shows up in this way traditionally, but then is discursively articulated in the form of patriotic versus unpatriotic engagements with the foreign, and corruption versus citizenship, internally viable citizenship. And one begins to see this here. Its climax really shows up in the discourse of the national security law and the national anthem law. One is a physical performance of patriotism, of allegiance to the anti-corrupt or the protection against the corruption, even as you're absorbing. And the other goes to the protection of the uncorruptible core of Hong Kong against those people who have been subsumed, corrupted, changed, who are no longer Hong Kong people. They're now corrupted elements of something else, either to use horrible terms, they are now hybrids, right? We used to call them half-breeds. That's now no longer an acceptable term, but you're neither one nor the other, which may mean that you are not us, so you may be more them than us. So hybridity, but hybridity in this case, which is not positive, but a negative hybridity, right? And all of this, of course, then comes from this notion of the black hand. And again, at the same time that the basic line continues, you really can't help it. There, with a footnote to the kinds of interesting efforts during the Cultural Revolution, but that's a story for another day. The openness of society, the openness of Chinese society, at the same time with a more significant focus on marking, on wariness, and on marking the boundaries between acceptable absorption, right, a more closed openness, and not the other way. But the Americans were going in the same direction as well, although we present this both discursively and in terms of policy a little differently.
Well, what's been described to me is that China is stuck in sort of a tango that they can't separate from with the international, with the foreign, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to control what is being embraced. Where am I deviating or being wrong on this one?
No. I mean, yes, you're right, but at the same time, that describes a baseline problem of globalization for everyone. I mean, this is a problem that the Americans have, and we've had this discussion. We continue to have this discussion in terms of the Europeans have this discussion. It discursively shows up in very different ways depending on your political culture, your history in the group. But all of this problem of the need for vibrant, dynamic, ancient cultures to continue to reproduce itself by an openness to the foreign, at the same time, an openness which is tinged with a fear that if you open too much, or you open in the wrong ways, or you don't absorb, then you lose your own autonomous integrity and you become something else.
But can't that
that's the problem.
But can't that fear come from, I guess you'd say, that what I previously described being analogous to the relationship that China has with the international or the foreign, be it the control that they have over Hong Kong. They are in a tango with the international, which although it's dated until 2047, there is a fear that this tango could become inseparable. And the foreign, the black hand is trying to make sure of that they are stuck dancing forever.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the fear. If in fact, right. And so this is the character of the openness here. If in fact what we're seeing here is something new, and we've described this I think in a different conversation as this kind of notion of fractured sovereignty. Yes. Right. And this is no longer an openness, a cultural openness to innovation. It's now a more formal structuring and limitation or management of that openness in ways in which the receiving country is unable to affect its contours. That becomes very threatening. And one can understand why the Chinese might view this as threatening. They have a political economic order. And the internationalism that is represented by the international communities, increasingly well developed by this point, stance on the character and nature, the international constitutionalist nature of Hong Kong, in that sense represents a threat, not a cultural threat or an economic threat, so much as a threat to the core ideology of the country. And there, right, the idea of absorption becomes much, much more problematic.
Okay.
Easiest absorption is I can make paint more efficiently by using this cool method that the Chileans have developed, as opposed to the methods that I've been using in my factory in Shanghai. That's
Okay.
easy. Harder, right, is I'm now going to use a particular way of interpreting contract in guiding the relationships between two economic actors. There may be a little culture and ideology mixed in. What am I really importing? What does that mean in terms of its naturalization for the way in which people, economic actors interact, you know, blah, blah, blah. A little harder, but can be done, right? Highways, right, absorb the notion that should we have more highways or more public transportation infrastructure, right? In this case, the Chinese might be said to have borrowed from the Americans, who borrowed from the Germans, though we all don't like to talk about this, right? The highway system comes from Europe in the 30s to the US in the 50s, to the Chinese in the 21st century, and then infrastructure back to the Americans now, who effectively are, one could be said to be absorbing the sensibilities of infrastructure planning in the form of the infrastructure bill that's currently before Congress. So that's the kind of open absorption that's fairly easy and bounces all over, irrespective of the fact that the political ideological systems from which it's springing could be not only antithetical to each other, but with respect to which we've gone to war, right? Much harder are, let's import the normative notion of judicial control of legal interpretation, or constitutional limitations on the part of a political state, the interpretation of which is vested in the people or in courts, right? At this point, right, what looks like an absorption of ideas becomes a threat to not only the autonomy, but to the legitimacy and character of the importing country, and that becomes much more problematic, right? And so here you've got that, again, that kind of thing, depending on how the Americans or the Chinese view the nature of the import, depending on whether it is viewed as benign, you know, we're importing this because we're importing ideas or know-how, or not benign. This was a problem, for example, when the Americans and the Canadians accused Huawei of embedding surveillance and backdoors into their 5G hardware, which then led ultimately to the big blow up, which remains unresolved, right? Depending on all of those things, the absorption becomes either incompatible or threatening in a national security kind of way, or in an existential way that is as a threat to the legitimacy of the social, political, and economic order into which it's coming, right? And so Hong Kong, here we're dealing with the nature, structure, and framework of the political order, and its challenge to the way in which the political constitutional ordering of the central authorities had been framed, certainly since 1949, and that becomes an area that is it's a much more threatening sort of interaction, right? But all of them, of course, then bound up. I'm going to switch this on you for a second, bound up in the way in which these countries view both how it's coming, where it's coming, and its utility. So when you're looking at this, right, I spent a bit of time talking about some of the modes of transmission, which I think nicely answer your point, which is really an excellent one. And so I'm reframing your question by asking, well, does the threat of the thing that is important to which you're open, does that depend on the way in which it is brought over, or the character of the person or institution or event that brings something over? Right? Does that make a difference? And in the context of this essay, I suggest that maybe it does, by looking at the kind of stereotypes. So you have the missionary, right? And that was Capon in 1911. The missionary can be viewed as both useful to some extent, to the extent they bring knowledge, but at the same time, highly threatening, because the object of the missionary is to change fundamentally some significant aspects of the host state. But interestingly enough, right, the way one viewed Protestant missionaries, perhaps at the beginning of the 20th century, suspiciously sounds like the way in which the American elite now views or uses as a factotum of some kind agents of the Chinese Communist Party in the US, right? They're missionaries. And so what they bring can be both useful, but also quite threatening, because we understand that underlying all of this is a fundamental commitment to transformative change, right? And that's very different from something like the expert. Everyone loves experts, right? Experts are easy, but experts can also be abused. And so you worry that there's a fine line between the expert and the spy, a useful foreigner and a threatening foreigner. In this case, those are the big binary, useful and threatening, right? And then we've got a bunch of variations of this. Some of my favorites: the sycophant, the colonizer, the expatriate, the entrepreneur, and the company person. All of these represent different forms of transmission, which probably affect both the character of the thing being brought in and the way in which the host state is willing or is open to its transmission.
Well, thank you for that in-depth defining of all 7 of those. The last question I wanted to ask you, on those, well, on this chapter in general, is which archetype of the foreigner do you think is the most dangerous to a nation, and does it change from nation to nation? Oh, I'm asking you for an opinion.
You're asking me for opinion, and you know I have no opinions.
Okay, all right, you don't have an opinion, but the author of this book, can he give an
opinion?
An opinion.
I guess he could, but you're not going to like it.
Ooh.
And you've heard that before in class, right?
Yeah.
The answer is, and this is the prototypical lawyer's answer, for which at some point we're all going to be rounded up and re-educated, right? The answer is it depends. Right. Wow. But I'm not going to leave you with it depends, and I'll explain why. In this case, I think context matters to some extent. Context matters. Missionaries can be quite useful, even though they present a threat, if they can be managed. If you're aware of what or who they are and you can watch them, you can still extract from them, knowing that there's always a risk, right, in your interactions with the missionary, because the object of the missionary is something other than merely the transmission of something useful to you. It's the transmission of something that is useful to them that may transform you in ways that you may not be interested in. But honestly, I guess, all right, so I'll give you an opinion. The most dangerous, although most people would probably not understand this until it's too late, it's just human nature, is the sycophant.
Okay.
The sycophant, and that is because, and I've been in a bunch of countries and I've seen a bunch of different systems, but I've noticed that indeed there is a common humanity among us, and that common humanity is perhaps best exhibited by our irresistible willingness to succumb to the sycophant. It doesn't matter whether you're a Marxist-Leninist, you are the most conservative capitalist or markets-oriented person, a liberal Democrat. The sycophant probably represents the most dangerous form of transmission for two reasons. The first is that the object of the sycophant is something other than the transmission, but in ways that are deceptive. It's being hidden. And then the second is that it is the sycophant's own interests that tend to mold the nature and character of the transmission itself, so that you can't even be sure of the value, authenticity, or legitimacy of the thing transmitted to you. Now, having said this, most people will say, oh, I know a sycophant when I see it, I can smell him a mile away, you know, blah, blah, blah. I'm prepared. I know how to deal with this. And my answer is no. Missionaries are easy. Corporate types are easy. The expert is actually the expert is the easiest. They tend to be very needy in ways that are easily managed. The entrepreneur is easy. The colonizer is extremely easy and useful. The sycophant will always get you when you least expect it. So there, I actually surprised you. I gave you an opinion.
Well, I appreciate you ending us off with an opinion. I do tend to agree with you on that, although I may say the entrepreneur is more dangerous than many people would think, because the controlling dynamics may not be where you see them at the same, in a similar way the sycophant wouldn't be. You may believe that you are in control when you in fact are not in control with the
Okay.
entrepreneur. And
No, I can see that. I can see that. It's the institutional veil makes
yes.
them much right. But you also sound like a man whose pocket has been picked.
No. My pockets are closed with zippers on them. But I would like to thank you for talking about chapter 16, and I look forward to talking about the next one, chapter 17, with you.
All right. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Have a nice day.
All right.